Hi there and welcome to the Clear Lake Middle School iPad Handbook. I'm Isla Apple and this is Ed Tech. Sit back, relax, and learn a little bit about how we do business with the iPads here at Clear Lake Middle School.
Thanks for the great introduction, Isla. You know, the iPad setting empowers students and teachers to access information using purposeful technology-based tools anytime a task calls for them. Learning at Clear Lake Middle School is a continuous and dynamic interaction among students, educators, parents, and the extended community. Implementation of a one-to-one initiative enables anywhere, anytime learning that is no longer limited to the four walls of a classroom building.
You know, Ed, there is Wi-Fi access downtown at many of those businesses. You can even sit in City Park and log into the internet if you have CLTEL. Anyway, when you go to check in your iPad, that would be when you leave Clear Lake schools or at the end of each school year, all iPads, cases, chargers, and any school-provided accessories must be returned. Just like a textbook or band uniform, the iPads are the property of Clear Lake Community School District, and students are responsible for returning them in reasonable condition. But you know what? 6th and 7th graders can take their iPads home over the summer.
You know, Isla, you bring up a great point about taking the iPad home. While we certainly encourage students to take their iPad home to use, we also ask that you use a little bit of common sense when you're transporting your iPad. For example, always make sure your iPad is in the case provided. The case has been researched and we know it's been a good case for our kids last year, and we know it's going to be a great case for our kids this year. Also, don't set anything on top of your iPad. Your iPad isn't a table or a serving tray, so keep all food and drink away from it. And finally, perhaps the most important thing to remember is that the iPad does belong to Clear Lake Community Schools.
You know, Ed, it would have been so cool if I could have taken an iPad home when I was in school. You know what, though? Teachers have certain expectations. Students need to be aware that they need to check their school messages, the announcements, calendars, and any schedules on their iPad. That's what it's there for. It's their responsibility to take their iPad to all classes unless specifically instructed not to do so by the teacher. And you know what? In order to tell whose iPad is whose, students need to have their first and last name on that lock screen. Any information on the iPad also needs to be kept safe, so a password of 4 digits is recommended.
You know, Isla, you just reminded me of something, and that's home internet access. Students are allowed to set up wireless networks on their iPads. This will assist them with their iPad use at home as well. Your filtering software at home is probably much different than the filtering software we use here at school. Sites that are restricted at school may not be restricted in your home, so parents, please make sure you monitor what your child is doing and how they're using their iPad when at home.
Now let's talk about the coolest part, iPad apps. Now most of those apps on your iPad will be requested by teachers, so make sure those are easily accessible at all times. But here's the cool part. Each student will be allowed 2 apps of their choice, which of course will be approved by the school personnel.
You know, Isla, somebody is bound to try and download apps that they shouldn't have, but we have a couple of secret weapons on our side. First is a piece of software, kids, called Meraki, which allows our tech integration coach, Mrs. Hill, to check any iPad, anytime, anywhere. Also, we're prone to do random iPad checks, which means just that. We might pop into your classroom someday, grab 2 or 3 iPads, see what's on them, and if you have things on there you shouldn't be, well, we're just going to turn you over to Mr. Quickle and see what he has to say about it.
Use of the CLCSD technology resources is a privilege, not a right. The privilege of using the technology resources provided by the CLCSD is not transferable or extendable by students to people or groups outside of the district and terminates when a student is no longer enrolled. The Clear Lake Community School District Responsible Use of Technology Agreement policy is provided to make all users aware of the responsibilities associated with efficient, ethical, and lawful use of technology resources. The CLCSD Student Code of Conduct shall be applied to student infractions. Violations may result in disciplinary action up to and including suspension or even expulsion for students. When applicable, law enforcement agencies may be involved.
I suppose it's about time that we talk about some basic responsibilities we all share. Let's start off with our parents and guardians. What should they think about in terms of their responsibilities with the iPad and the supervision of their kids?
Well, parents always need to keep an eye on their kids when they have that iPad at home. But if they don't really feel that they want that responsibility, they can always sign a form indicating that they would like the student to keep the iPad at home.
The school, we have some responsibilities as well. And one of those kind of falls on your shoulders, and that's the monitoring of the iPad. We have software that allows Isla and her best friend, Mrs. Hill, to check iPads at any time. And we also need to make sure that our internet and wireless connection is always up and running so teachers and kids have the best possible experience. With that said, our filtering software might be a little bit more stringent than the filtering software you use at home. So we want to make sure that parents and the school also are keeping in contact, making sure that safe sites and unsafe sites remain accessible or inaccessible at any given day.
That's so true, and if students stay on that student network, they shouldn't have any problem. Speaking of the students, they really need to make sure that they're using that iPad in a responsible and ethical manner.
And should they come across anything that's inappropriate, they need to contact any staff member and they'll make sure that they get the problem reported to the proper person.
And that could include maybe losing their iPad, but they should always keep an eye on it and monitor all activity on their account, even their device.
And if they're keeping track of their device well, they know that they're going to be keeping track of where they store their iPad. Don't leave your iPad unattended at any time. You're responsible for what is in your iPad and for where your iPad is located.
We do try and keep things secure around here, but if a student should ever receive inappropriate digital content, he or she should immediately notify an adult.
Now, for students that are leaving us, unfortunately, we need to make sure that we get our iPad back. So on your last day of school with us, we're going to ask that you turn the iPad in, and maybe even a little bit sooner if you're not sure of when you're going to be leaving us.
So just remember that includes the iPad, the case, the charger, the cord, and any other accessory that you received with that iPad.
You know, Isla, I suppose it's time we talk about some of the bigger no-nos that go along with using the iPad and surfing the internet both here and at home.
Okay, Ed. First, let's start with illegal installation or transmission of copyrighted materials. You know, copyrighted materials are owned by someone else, and that might really hurt their feelings. And then there's always sending, accessing, uploading, downloading, or distributing offensive, profane, threatening, obscene, or even sexually explicit materials.
And the use of outside data disks or external attachments without prior approval from the administration is a big no-no.
In addition to that, changing the iPad settings, that'll just mess everything up. So just leave things the way they are.
And students, just remember, you're not allowed to download apps unless approved by school personnel. Students will be able to download at least 2 apps of your choice, so that's pretty cool.
And you know what? You probably should stay away from other students' accounts.
You know, Isla, while those are some pretty important no-nos to remember, there's a few that are even bigger. For example, all students and teachers, and heck, even Mr. Quickle, are expected to comply with trademark and copyright laws and all licensing agreement. Ignorance of the law is not immunity. If you're not sure, ask a teacher or parent. Plagiarism is copying somebody else's work, and Isla already talked about that. Again, it's your responsibility to know that plagiarism is illegal. And finally, the use or possession of hacking software is strictly prohibited. Give it a shot. If you're caught, you will be criminally prosecuted.
Whoa, I sure am glad that that is over. Now, Ed, let's talk about protecting and storing your iPad. First, each iPad is labeled with an identification number. If you look under your kickstand, you will see your asset tag number. Then there will be a Clear Lake Community School District label found on the back of the iPad. As we talked about before, each student should have their first and last name on the lock screen. And lastly, so it's easy for Mrs. Hill to identify the iPad in Meraki, students need to name their iPad. This can be found in Settings, About, and then the username. As a reminder, iPads should not be left unattended in classrooms or in areas of extreme heat or cold temperatures.
You know, Isla, accidents do happen, and when they do, it's unfortunate. However, students will be held responsible for all damage to their iPads, including, but not limited to, broken screens, damaged cases, and general inoperability. In other words, meaning it just doesn't work. Lost items such as cases and cables will be charged the actual cost of replacement. But should you damage your iPad, the cost of the first repair will be $50 and the iPad will remain in school until the repair is paid in full. Should you damage your iPad a second time, the cost of repair will be $75 and again the iPad will remain in school until it's paid for in full. Should you damage your iPad a third time, that repair will be the actual cost or replacement of the iPad. And again, the iPad will remain in school until the repair or replacement is paid in full. Now, if your iPad is lost, we need you to report it to the school immediately so we can let Mrs. Hill know to try to track down your iPad. Also, if you feel your iPad has been stolen, you need to report this immediately to the police and file a report, at which time a copy of that report should be given to the school as well.
We have some additional information. In cases of theft, vandalism, and other criminal acts, a police or fire report must be filed. Students and parents are responsible for full payment of intentional damages to the iPads.
And Isla, what's up with FaceTime? Why do we want students to get permission first?
While it can be used strictly for educational purposes only and under the direct supervision of staff, FaceTime requires sizable amounts of bandwidth and therefore can slow the school network. We don't want a slow network.
And finally, Isla, what's up with the iTunes accounts anyway?
Well, the district will be using Apple's new Apple Deployment Program for the iPads. That allows Mrs. Hill to directly push apps to the iPads so students don't have to wait for them to load. This program will require students to create a personal Apple ID through the Apple ID for Students program. So that means if the student is under 13 years old, parents must create that Apple ID.
So on behalf of Isla and myself, we want to thank you for spending just a few minutes with us learning more about our iPad program and the policies associated with it. But before you go, don't forget to check out the electronic signature here.
So enjoy this opportunity and make the most of your tech experience here at Clear Lake Middle School.